What up, guys? Welcome back to the Wellness Path Podcast. Excited to have you here. My name is Dr. Vic, and excited to dive into this topic a little deeper. And I'll keep it kind of general, but I'm going to break down some of the elements of how this affects pediatric health and what we're seeing in kids today. So a lot of times, what I've been noticing, what I've been seeing in practice is a lot of kids are easily overstimulated. Right? There's a variety of things going on. It may be social, emotional, it may be digestive, immune system. It may be a whole platoon of things going on there, bedwetting and so many other things. But and sometimes it's multitudes of this, multiple layers, and there's all the labels, the alphabetical soup thrown under this, and so much more. And I've been seeing this more and more as I get older and older and longer in practice. And one of the things that I do, besides being a pediatric chiropractor and going through my certification, 200 hours, and really understanding the different elements, and all it really means of being a certified pediatric chiro is just, I have more tools in my toolbox to work with different things and how to help kiddos. And then everything I do in my training is always looking at how can I help the neurology, the nervous system, the brain, be able to adapt? How can I give it resets? And this is why I do things like microcurrent auricular therapy. This is why I do things, cranial nasal release technique, variety of different stuff to help posture reflexes, primitive reflexes, and so much more, to really have the tools to help as much as I can, or refer out to some professionals who do those things, and I can just focus on the chiro, depending on where we are and who I'm working with. But today I want to talk a lot about primitive reflexes. I've been working the last month, and I've been seeing a lot of kiddos, and a lot of these kiddos still have primitive reflexes firing, and they should be turned off. So what I want to do is talk a little about what primitive reflexes are, so we have a general understanding of it. And then I'm going to talk about what does that do to the brain, and then why, and I'll share some of my clinical pearls or clinical stuff that I've gone through that made me get more interested in that because of what I saw in my own practice and serving kids and so much more. So first thing first, primitive reflexes. They're primitive. They're designed for one thing. Kids start out horizontal, right? I call them the rock. They're just rocking. They're a rock. You got to pick them up, got to hold them around. They're not doing much. Probably 3-4 months, they start turning. Hopefully by 6 to about 8 months in, they start crawling. And hopefully by a year, they're upright. The whole purpose of a kiddo's life, neurologically speaking, is getting horizontal and getting them up vertical in that first year. Okay, it's very critical. What helps a kiddo do all this for survival mechanisms is something called primitive reflex. You have one if you do breastfeeding, you touch the side of the mouth here, touch the up here by the cheek area, right by the lip, they should perk up, open, and they usually turn to that side. Natural reflex to always know that if mom's trying to feed them, they have that reflex, and it sticks around for a little bit. And then you have things like what everybody knows, the palmar grasp reflex, right? Put their finger in their hand and they go, and they have a vice grip, right? Survival, hold on, make sure they don't fall if mom's holding them, things like that. These are just generalities, but I'm trying to share some basics to this. Then you have other ones that are called the plantar reflex. This one's right under the toes. If you push it, so they have the hand one, put your finger under their toes are going to vice grip on, try to clamp on, right? So there's that one. There's Babinski, which is a striking of the foot and the toes will flare out. And Galant. This is the one where if you strike the back, they should bend to that side. And it helps them to get to rotate and so forth. And there's other ones that will come on later on and so forth. Landau, placing, moral. I can go on and on with all these. And they're all important. And there's times when they should be on. And there's times when they should turn off. Critically important. Here's the issue, though. If a child goes through a stressful event known as birth, it's traumatic and some are traumatic, right? But it is a stressful experience. Their nervous systems get activated, the sympathetic, that revving part kicks in, the survival kicks in, they cry, now they're in a certain state. Now, depending how the birth process goes, that adds to it, and birth leads the way to everything. As a business coach, not all the time, but most times I'll ask my clients, hey, how were you born? And they'll kind of be like, imagine you're paying a good amount of money to a business coach, and he's asking you, how were you born? You're going to sit there and go, what's this purpose of? And I've had clients ask me, like, what's the purpose of you asking me this? I said, just humor me, and then I'll explain why later. So they go ahead and they tell me. And I said, that makes sense. Oh, you're a C-section baby. Great. She had bump going on. They're like, how does that correlate? Or they may have had Mom labored for a really long time. I got stuck in the canal for a minute, and then they finally got me out, maybe a little forceps, vacuum, whatever. I'm like, that might mean this may explain why you have this, and this. And they sit there and go, how do you know that? And I said, well, the birth process is the beginning of all things. I only know this because of my pediatric training and understanding that birth plays a huge role in a lot of things. 95% of kids are going to have an issue with their first bone in their neck or some part of their neck. They have a subluxation in that area, most of the time it's C1, where the birth process happens. It's a lot of stress on these kids. And women today, their pelvises are not, they're starting to shrink down more. We're not moving like we used to. Our whole society from 100 years ago plus is totally different. And we don't do the certain things that we did. So body adapts to these things. And I think because of that makes sometimes pregnancy a little harder. Not saying that we can still do all those things, but it's just more challenging. We just don't move that way. And I think one time, they always say it's first birth is a certain way and the second birth is easier. Well, I think there's two reasons to that. First, you're used to it. You've been through it. I think that's just one of the biggest things. Muscle memory, body gets used to it. You've gone through it before. Okay. Second, though, and my wife made this observation, you're on the floor playing with your kid more. You're doing some of those ways we used to move. And I think that plays a huge part in a lot of this. So when we look at that, but that's where everything will happen. And so when you have these stresses turned on, right? Because when we have not good range of motion, so all kids should be checked by a chiropractor the moment they're born. And usually after 2 weeks is when we start to see things start to show up a little bit. But they all should be checked because if they're not moving properly, if they're favoring one side, you can see the eyes tilted one with the other. Their jaw doesn't open up nice and even. They favor a certain side. Just to name a few different things, this is where they're not getting proper range of motion. And when you have less range of motion, you don't feed the brain properly. And that turns on stress in that nervous system. So this is where it begins. So now when we have primitive reflexes that need to turn off, brain's overoccupied with so many things happening that it can't turn it to a 0. So the volume's a 10, which is like, hey, finger in the hand, boom, hard grip. So that's a level 10. A level 1 to a level 2 is what we'll normally see as we strike the hand, you get a little bit of some moving and twitching in the fingers. That tells me that it's still turned on. And what the brain does is says, hey, we got a lot going on. We can only do so much. Let's just dial that down to what we can handle for now, and we're just going to move forward. Okay? Fine. It works, right? You may not notice much in your kiddo. Later on, things may show up, but you may not notice it then. And this is the critical part of primitive reflexes and why I got big into checking them is because what happens is if that does not turn off properly, and there are other reflexes that kick in later, and then those should turn off also, and if they don't turn off, it makes it even harder for your child to get back into a normal tone, re-regulate itself better. And that's why 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, we see a lot of dysregulation. And then 6, 7, 8, it gets even worse emotionally, social emotionally, withdrawing effects. I had a 4-year-old, almost 4, does not like to play at the park with kids. Just doesn't. And I'm like, that's not normal. Now, what I say by that is I'm like, listen, it just tells me there's a lot of overwhelm happening in that nervous system. And it just takes that little thing of having someone at the park, just takes it over. Just that much. And it throws off his nervous system. And I said, what we need to do is just help him regulate better. And we're going to do that. And we do that through chiropractic care, number 1. That's the first thing and the most important thing to do. I've worked with a lot of OTs. And all the OTs that I've worked with who refer to me, and I would refer to them, is that they noticed that when they refer to me and they're getting OT and they get chiro, they saw faster results in their practice with those kids than they did without chiropractic. And that's one of the reasons why they would constantly refer, because they're like, okay, what's the best thing we can do for this kid? And I see the same way for kiddos. When I'm working with kids, I'm looking at different ways of how can I help the kiddo get to the fastest level possible. And I always want to get their nervous system at a certain state first. And then once I do, then I'm like, okay, great. Now let's refer out and let's get them to help other things that they need, plus what we're doing here. And so that being said, this is where, you get this regulation, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. Anxiety kicks in. We see more kids now with anxiety than ever before, having anxiety issues, anxiousness, racing thoughts, OCD, and all these different things. And it all comes back to this stuff. And so primitive is the most important because it's the foundation to everything. The horizontal, the vertical, that's what we're trying to do. The brain doubles in size in that first year. That's a lot of growth, 1.5 trillion connections to 15 trillion connections, roughly on average. These are monumental numbers we're talking about here. A lot is happening for these kiddos. And so This is why chiropractic care is essential. It's not a, oh, what if my kid has this, or constipation, or colic, or immune issues, or XYZ. No, 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 no. It's way more than just that. And so with that all being said, well, let's take it a step back here. So if primitives don't turn off properly, it affects the next layer of brain development. You have to understand, if you can imagine a pyramid or a triangle, there's layers to all this. And there's 4 layers I want to talk about. So the primitive is the base one. The next one that's going to be there is called the vestibular system. Balance, hand, coordination, movement, right? Because what happens now? They're vertical. So they're vertical now. They need to figure out their balance. This is why when a kid first walks, they're not walking all beautiful and smooth. They're plopping. They're like boom, boom, and they're slamming their feet hard on the floor, right? That's beautiful. That's important. That's what they need to do to get the proper stimulation so the brain can learn, this is the sensory. Okay. And over time, a year or 2 years in of walking, they can start to walk more graceful, and they'll have a better walk to themselves because their brain has developed and learned that from the vestibular system. There's also something called posture reflexes that help with that. There are reflexes that help the body get adapted to walking properly. This is another conversation for another time when those stay turned on. But long story short, we get the vestibular system. Okay. Now, the third layer. Okay. So what happens though is the primitives stay on. They're going to affect the vestibular system in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes you don't see any symptoms like that. Most kids I work with, I'll talk to mom and say, are they clumsy? Or, you know, no, oh yes, their coordination's horrible. They can't do this or this, or they have issues here. And I'm like, Now what I'm doing is I'm looking and saying, okay, they had primitive reflexes turned on. So now I already know vestibular is going to be affected. Whether symptoms or don't show, it's a building block. You can't finish one level at 90% and then expect the next level to get at 100%. You're going to have that deficit right there right off the bat in the next level. So the third one then becomes ocular. So this is all hand-eye coordination, hands and the eyes. It's also acuity of the eyes, right? So you see a lot more kids now wearing glasses. Sometimes they can even have what's a lazy eye. The eye doesn't track properly. These are anything related to the eyes itself. There'll be something of it minutely, but it will show up. If we evaluate and look at the eyes, we'll see something like a nystagmus where they'll go up to a certain side and we'll see a little shake, or we'll see the eye can't track, or it's not tracking evenly, or I'll put their finger like this and I want to see the eyes come together and they'll see a little shift and they're not perfectly symmetrical. These are things that I'm looking for to know, okay, ocular system's affected in some way. If that gets unchecked, then it goes to the next layer of development, which is going to be language and cognitive functions. Okay. So language is any milestone with speaking. It's comprehension. It's looking at the pronunciation of words. All those different things are going to play a role in the milestones when it comes to language. And then cognitive functions will also relate to, I put on their behavioral stuff because that's going to show up also in there in that aspect. So when you have primitive stuff, the primitive stuff, what ends up happening is that is going to affect all those layers. So from a chiropractic perspective, I look at this, and whenever I see one on, I know all, depending on their age, I already know all the other ones are affected. So then I know we have to get the nervous system established as best as we possibly can because there's a lot of dysregulation going on. And then from there, what we do is we're going to go ahead and now work on the primitive stuff and also maybe other things too. Now, I want to share a little something here to what I hit as a roadblock in my own practice years ago that got me more interested in posture and primitive reflexes and why I do it so much now in my practice. So 5 years in, I was seeing kids, and about 5-6 years into my practice, I was seeing kids and we were getting some great results. Chiropractic works wonders. I had a mentor at the time who was like, you got to adjust them way more than what you've been doing. So I was like, that makes sense. Their brain fires a lot faster than ours do. So that's a good thing because they'll learn a good habit, but they'll also look bad habits fast too. So I was like, you know what if, I'm going to go ahead. I was like, what if we're going to have to speed up the process? So we did, and we got better results with kids. But there was a but. About, around 88%, 92% of my kids we had some great results. The rest of that, 10, 12%, they were better, but they still were things that I just don't understand why it wasn't clearing. And parents were big feedback. They're like, we're happy where we are, but there's a couple things here that I just still noticed. And I'm like, man, I don't understand. And so then I was like, okay, well, I need to get better I don't like not knowing, and I need to figure out what can I do to understand this and why, because I'm not okay with this. I like 100%. I'm a perfectionist. I know maybe I won't ever get 100% results, but I'm going to do everything in my power to whatever. If I have to find a referral, a network, a professional, whatever it is, I'm going to use everything that I can think of to help. I'm actually going to throw a kitchen sink at everything. I'm going to do it in a very logistic and systematic way. So long story short, that's where I got into the world of primitive imposture. And what I found out was, and this is just my experience, I don't know if there's any science on this, but what I've learned in my experience, I started looking at this more, and I looked at my own data, was that about 50 to 60% of the time, chiropractic will turn off primitive imposture reflexes. So it actually will turn them off. I had a kiddo right now, an autistic kid that I'm working with, highly functional, and she had 3 of them on, 15 adjustments, and 3 times a week. And we did the re-exam. All 3 of them turned off. Now we're doing some other stuff in the mix with it, so it wasn't just one thing. There was a lot of other things we mixed in, but that helped accelerate that process. So when I started to look at primitive imposture reflex, it made more sense. Because one of the things I learned is that if you have a primitive reflex or a posture, let's stick at the primitive reflexes, if they're on and they're still on, like I said, 50 to 60% of chiropractic can help. But if they stay on even with that, one of the issues with them is it doesn't allow chiropractic to get deeper into that healing state. It kind of limits it. It doesn't allow to stimulate that what we call vagal tone. It's part of the vagus nerve. It's cranial nerve 9 that comes off the brain. And this is a huge part of regulation. And we can't stimulate it as well. So what happens is we work with the primitive reflexes to get it turned off, and then the adjustments can be even more powerful. So this is the key component when we look at primitive reflexes and why they're so critical to be evaluated, to make sure your kiddo, his brain is developing the way it's supposed to. This is something we call them, and it's called other people call this too, the brain gap, right? So we're looking at the brain gap of where your child's gestational age, the age that they actually are, and then the age of the brain. And how much is the brain not fully? There's a gap there. And the farther the gap, the more dysregulation, the more labels are put on, and so many other things. And this is why I don't get into labels, right? I had a mom one time like, don't mention ADHD. It really bothers my son. And he was 8 years old. And I looked at him and I said, we don't do labels here. Because labels don't really, we don't do labels. Because if we get to the nervous system to function better and we change all this, whatever that label was should go away. And I told mom too, and I tell this to parents all the time. My job as the chiropractor is just to help your child's nervous system regulate better. That is the purpose of what I'm trying to do, and try to get that brain to get used to that regulation and build up the reserves to be able to do that. And from there, they thrive more. They're happier. They have less, sicknesses and all these other things that happen. And that's the beauty and the power of chiropractic, of what it does. And especially neuro-focused or neural-centered type chiropractic, which means we just focus on the brain and spinal cord, and we look at how that's functioning. We don't look at symptoms, even though the symptoms bring you into the office. What we do is we just go, hey, we're going to look at how this nervous system's functioning, what's going on, not really concerned about all the labels back there, because if I can understand what's happening here, I take care of this. Usually takes care of those labels and all these other things that happen there. And so that's kind of the process. And then we'll add primitive and other things like that to help with that. So that's the key element when it comes to development of the brain, is making sure those primitive reflexes are turned off. And it's great to work with a chiropractor that's trained in these things, especially a certified pediatric chiropractor. There are other chiropractors that aren't certified, and they're great too. But the thing is, a certified pediatric chiropractor went through the training. They have the tools, especially one from the ICPA. That's the one I went through, the International Chiropractic Pediatric Association. There's other ones out there, but that's the one I'm very, very appreciative of the work that they do. They're very deep into the science of things and really helping these kiddos learn how to thrive, and the tools that we can do to help them, not only just through chiropractic, but the different angles of how we can help approach them. And that's the one thing I truly love and appreciate as being a chiropractor, especially trained in that realm, is to go so deep into that. So that being said, if you have any questions, you got our information below. If you're a mom, a parent, you have a child who's struggling, maybe you're not in the Knoxville, Maryville, Morristown area in Tennessee, no worries. We have connections all throughout the United States, even internationally. So if there's anyone that you're looking for, we have referrals that we can find you if you're not in this area, if you're listening to this podcast, to get you connected with someone so that you can get the type of care that we're talking about, that I have seen that helps tremendously. Because I have kiddos now we're working with, and we do this work once if they need the posture or the primitive reflexes, and we start implementing them into the process, it becomes a big game changer for them, and parents see it drastically. I had a kiddo who had some social anxiety like crazy. And we did chiro, primitive, auricular therapy, cranial work. These are the things I do. And what was fascinating is within like in 12 visits, mom's like, she's actually looking forward to now going to school. She's looking forward to being with her friends. She still has that apprehension and anxiety. So that's a trained habit. She's 10 years old. It's a trained habit. It's going to take some time to work out. Let the brain but give us 3 months, give us 3-4 months. It's going to train it. But at least you're seeing the anxiety come down already. That's beautiful. That's regulation. She goes, yeah, I also know she's nicer to her siblings. She's nicer to me a little bit more. These are little changes I'm seeing, but it's crazy. It's not crazy, but she's like, it's just, I can't believe how this is amazing how this is all working out. She's like, I just don't understand how this all works. I was like, you don't need to. I go, I could share all the stuff, but here's the thing. We're getting the results. And then we check the re-exam and we look and see how is that nervous system shifting? What's happening there so that we can go ahead and make sure that we are seeing it neurologically for them and so much more. So any questions, let me know. You got my information in the show notes. Check out there. And then also, if you really liked this episode and you know a mom or a parent who can need this information, send a text to them right now. Send the link over to share that with them so they can tune into this. And subscribe so you don't miss another one. Appreciate you so much. And until next time, keep rocking and rolling.